I lost everything in a single morning, by the hands of my own son. 40 years. 40 years I had poured my sweat, blood, and tears into this land. And then Colton, my son, whom I had carried in my arms since he was a toddler, signed a piece of paper behind my back and sold it all. No question, not a trace of shame, only Vanessa's icy smile beside him. But they didn't know one thing. I wasn't finished yet. If you're reading this story, like, subscribe, and comment your city name below so I know how far my story has come. Then stay, because what happens next will keep you glued to the page. The morning they told me I no longer owned my own land, the sky was doing what it always did in early October out here in Harlan County. Pale gold and wide open, the kind of sky that makes you believe the world is still honest. I remember standing on the porch, coffee going cold in my hand, watching the horses move along the fence line the way they had every morning for the better part of 4 decades. I remember thinking the day felt ordinary. That's the thing about the worst moments of your life. They rarely announce themselves. The man who knocked on my door that morning was not a stranger. He was Dale Pruitt, an attorney out of Buckhorn, a man I'd known since he was young enough to be carted at the Rusty Nail Bar on Route 9. He had the look of someone who'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He was holding a manila envelope, and the way he held it, tight against his chest like a shield, told me everything before he said a word. "Gideon," he said. He cleared his throat. "I need you to look at something." My name is Gideon Mercer. I am 67 years old. I was born in this valley, raised on this land, and I buried my wife, Ruth, in the small cemetery plot behind the oak grove on the eastern edge of the property. Land that has been in my family for 3 generations. I built the main house with my own hands in 1987, framed every wall, poured the foundation in sections over 2 summers because I couldn't afford to do it all at once. I know every creek and every floorboard. I know where the water table runs shallow in the southeast corner and why you have to seed that pasture 2 weeks later than the rest. I know this land the way you know a person you've loved for a very long time. And in the space of about 45 minutes, standing on my own porch reading through documents I could barely process, I learned that none of that mattered anymore. The ranch, all 812 acres of it, every outbuilding, every water right, every easement and recorded boundary, had been transferred out of my name approximately 11 weeks earlier. The deed now listed one owner, Colton Ray Mercer, my son. And 3 weeks after that transfer was recorded, Colton had sold the entire property to a development group called Vantage Pacific Holdings for $4.2 million. I read the papers 3 times. Then I set down my coffee cup on the porch railing very carefully because my hands had begun to shake and I did not want to drop it. "Dale," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Tell me how this is possible." He looked out at the pasture instead of at me. "The transfer documents were filed with your signature, Gideon. Notarized, everything processed clean." He paused. "I'm sorry, I genuinely am, but on paper this sale is legal." "I never signed anything." He didn't answer that. He just kept looking at the horses. I want to tell you something about Colton before I go any further, because if I don't, you might think I'm the kind of father who never saw his child clearly. The truth is more complicated than that, and the truth matters here. Colton was not a bad child. I want to be honest about that even now, even after everything. He was curious and quick-tempered and sometimes generous in ways that surprised me. When he was 12, he spent 3 weekends helping the Garner family down the road rebuild their barn after a fire took it down, and he never once mentioned it to me. I heard about it from old Walt Garner at the feed store. That was a version of Colton that was real, but there was always another version running just underneath it. A version that watched what other people had and felt the distance between that and what he had like a physical ache. He grew up understanding that the ranch was valuable, and somewhere in his 20s that understanding curdled into something uglier. He stopped seeing the land as a legacy and started seeing it as an asset that was being poorly managed by an old man who didn't know how to maximize it. I didn't see how far that thinking had gone. That's on me. I trusted him because I wanted to trust him, and I let that wanting blind me to what was right in front of my face. He met Vanessa at a real estate conference in Denver 7 years ago. She was 34, sharp, ambitious, and she looked at Colton the way people look at a tool they've just found that fits exactly what they need. I'm not saying she didn't love him in her own way. I'm saying her love was attached to conditions I didn't fully understand until too late. Vanessa had plans, big ones. She wanted to build a luxury residential development, high-end ranch-style homes on large parcels, marketed to wealthy buyers from out of state who wanted the idea of Western living without the inconvenience of actual ranching. She had the vision and the connections. What she needed was capital and land. My land. I remember the first dinner she came to, sitting at my kitchen table, asking questions about the property with this bright professional smile that I mistook for genuine interest. How much acreage? What were the mineral rights situation? Had I ever had it formally appraised? At the time, I thought she was just the kind of person who asked a lot of questions. I thought it was a good quality. Ruth would have seen through it immediately. Ruth had a gift for reading people that I never fully developed on my own. But Ruth had been gone for 4 years by the time Vanessa came into our lives, and her absence left a gap in my judgment that I didn't even realize was there. The 11 weeks before that October morning were weeks I had spent doing exactly what I always did: running the ranch, managing the cattle operation, dealing with the small crises that come with any working property. A section of fence along the north boundary that needed replacing. A dispute with the water district about seasonal allocation rights. Hiring 2 new hands to replace men who'd moved on. During those weeks, Colton called me 3 times. Not to discuss business, just to talk, or what passed for talking. Mostly him asking vague questions about my health, whether I was keeping up okay, whether I'd thought about making things simpler. I told him I was fine. I told him I didn't need things made simpler. I told him the ranch was running the way it always had. What I didn't know was that during those same 11 weeks, he and Vanessa were meeting with attorneys, document specialists, and a notary who would later lose his license over what happened. They were building the legal architecture of a theft while I was fixing fence posts and arguing about water rights. The signature on the transfer documents was mine, my name, my handwriting's general shape, something close enough to pass through a standard title company review. How they obtained a signature to copy from, I later learned, was simpler than you'd think. There were documents I'd signed over the years. Routine ranch business, a lease amendment, a water rights filing from 2019 that Colton had handled on my behalf when I was recovering from knee surgery. He'd kept copies. He'd had someone study them. And then someone had reproduced what they needed. It was patient, deliberate. That's what hit me hardest. Standing on that porch with Dale Pruitt not meeting my eyes. Not that my son had made a desperate, impulsive mistake. He had planned this. He had sat across from me at that kitchen table, eaten my food, called me on the phone, and all the while he had been building the mechanism that would take everything I had. "What are my options?" I asked Dale. He finally looked at me. "You can contest the transfer, challenge the signature, get a handwriting expert, initiate a fraud investigation. It's a legitimate path, Gideon, but I have to be straight with you. It's going to be expensive, it's going to take time, and Colton has already retained counsel, good counsel." He hesitated. "Vanessa's real estate contacts, they know people. How much time? Could be a year, could be 2, could be longer if it goes to the appellate level." He folded his hands together. "And in the meantime, Vantage Pacific is the legal owner of record. You'd be trespassing on your own property." That word landed somewhere in my chest and sat there like a stone. Trespassing. I was quiet for a long moment. Out in the pasture, one of the horses, the old bay mare I'd had for 11 years, a horse my wife had named Calliope, lifted her head and looked back toward the house. Just for a moment. Then she went back to grazing. "Where's Colton?" I said. "From what I understand, he and Vanessa have moved into a property in Telluride, a second home they've had for about a year." A second home. While I was here fixing fence posts, my son had been buying a second home in Telluride. "Thank you for coming out, Dale," I said. He looked at me with the expression of a man who expects a reaction, anger, collapse, something, and isn't sure what to do when it doesn't come. "Gideon, I know this is... I want you to understand that you have people who..." "I appreciate you coming," I said. "Drive safe." He left. I stood on that porch until his truck disappeared down the long gravel drive and the dust settled. Then I sat down in the old wooden chair that had been there since before Ruth died, the one she used to sit in on summer evenings, reading, and I looked out at the land that 4 generations of my family had worked. I sat there for a very long time. I should tell you that I cried exactly once during the days that followed. One afternoon, about a week after Dale's visit, I walked out to the cemetery plot behind the oak grove and sat down on the ground next to Ruth's stone. The stone is simple, just her name, her dates, and a single line she had always liked, something her own mother used to say, "Tend what you're given." I sat there in the afternoon light and I let it out. The grief, the humiliation, the sheer disorienting wrongness of what had happened. And when it was done, I wiped my face on my sleeve and I stood up. That was the only time. After that, I made a decision. I was not going to spend what was left of my life drowning in what had been done to me. I was not going to fall apart and give Colton and Vanessa the satisfaction of watching an old man come undone. That wasn't the person Ruth had spent 31 years living beside, and it wasn't the person I intended to be now. But I also was not going to walk away. People kept telling me to let it go. Friends, or people I had believed were friends, started pulling away from me during those early weeks in a way I hadn't anticipated. I understood it to a point. A legal fight against a son who had counsel and resources and a completed sale looked hopeless from the outside. People didn't want to invest themselves in something that appeared unwinnable. Frank Delgado, who I'd ranched alongside for 20 years, told me over coffee that I should take whatever settlement they offer and start fresh somewhere. Tom and Linda Haverhill, who had been to my house for Christmas dinner 3 years running, stopped returning calls. I can't pretend that didn't hurt. When you're already down, discovering the dimensions of who actually stands by you is its own particular kind of education. The ones who stayed were few. Marguerite, who had managed my books for 12 years, and who was angrier about what had happened than I allowed myself to be. Roy Dillard, my head ranch hand, who was 62 years old and had worked this land for 19 of them, and who told me flatly that he didn't work for Vantage Pacific and he'd be damned if he was going to start. And my attorney of record, a woman named Carol Ashby out of Denver, who I reached out to on the 4th day and who listened to everything I told her without interrupting, and then said, "Gideon, I need everything you have. Every document, every communication, every signature you ever produced in connection with this property. Start pulling it together." Carol Ashby was not the kind of attorney who made you feel better. She made you feel like you were in a fight, which was what I needed. Here is what I knew in those early weeks and what I had to be careful about knowing too loudly. Colton and Vanessa believed I was broken. I understood that clearly. The story they were telling themselves, and I imagine telling their Telluride friends over their expensive wine, was that the old man had tried to hold on to something for too long, and the modern world had simply caught up with him. They probably believed I would spend the next few months getting advice from well-meaning people, burning through whatever savings I had left, and eventually accepting some kind of structured settlement that would make the whole thing go away quietly. What they did not know was that over my 40 years of running this ranch, I had developed certain habits that would now become very inconvenient for them. I kept records. Obsessive, meticulous, dated records of everything connected to the property. Financial records, maintenance records, records of every conversation I'd had with contractors, with county officials, with anyone connected to the operation of the ranch. I had binders. Stacks of them, going back decades. Not because I'd ever anticipated something like this, but because Ruth had instilled in me early in our marriage the discipline of documentation. If it matters, write it down. If you write it down, keep it. She had grown up watching her own family lose things because they couldn't prove what they knew to be true, and she had been determined that would never happen to us. When I pulled those binders out of the locked storage room off the main barn, the room Colton had apparently not thought to look through during his planning, or perhaps had dismissed as the pack rat hobby of an old man, I sat down with Marguerite and we started going through them. It took 6 days. What we found, working carefully through 12 years of financial records alongside the documentation Colton had filed on my behalf during the period he'd acted as my business representative, was a pattern that had not been visible to me in real time, but was very clear in hindsight. Small things at first. Invoices that had been paid from ranch accounts for expenses that didn't match anything in the property records. A consulting fee paid to a firm I didn't recognize, repeated quarterly. Withdrawals from the operating account that corresponded in timing to deposits into an account I had no record of. None of it enormous in isolation. Together, over the course of 8 years, it added up to somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 that had quietly left my operation and gone somewhere I couldn't immediately trace. "Gideon," Marguerite said on the evening of the 5th day, looking up from her laptop with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Marguerite was a practical woman who did not frighten easily. "This isn't just the transfer, this goes back a long time." "I know," I said. "This was deliberate. This was years of deliberate—" She stopped, started again. "He wasn't just opportunistic. He was building toward something." "Yes," I said. She looked at me carefully. "How long have you suspected?" "I haven't," I said. "Until now. That's the honest answer." I folded my hands on the table. "But now that I see it, I can read the whole map." What the map showed was this. Colton had not woken up one morning and decided to steal the ranch. He had been positioning himself for years, gradually taking on more and more of the administrative functions of the property. Filing documents, managing certain accounts, acting as my representative in situations where I'd allowed it because I trusted him and because the administrative demands of a working ranch are considerable. Building, piece by piece, the legal footprint he would need when the time came. And when Vanessa's development plans had reached the stage where they needed land and capital, the footprint was ready. It was sophisticated. I won't give them anything I don't have to give them, but it was sophisticated. This hadn't been done by people who were careless, which meant that when I came for them, I would need to be more careful than they were. I want to tell you about the day I called Colton. It was 3 weeks after Dale Pruitt's visit. I had spent those 3 weeks doing 3 things simultaneously, working with Carol Ashby to build the legal challenge, working with Marguerite to document the financial history, and maintaining the outward appearance of a man who was struggling and possibly defeated. That last part was deliberate. I did not want Colton and Vanessa to know what I was building. I needed their confidence to hold. I called him on a Tuesday evening from the kitchen where I had eaten dinner with Ruth 10,000 times. He answered on the second ring. "Dad?" His voice was careful, rehearsed, maybe. "Colton?" Silence. Then, "I figured you'd call eventually." "Did you?" "Look," he said, I know it doesn't feel good, but Dad, the ranch was never going to survive another generation. You know that. The operation was too small to be competitive, the land taxes were going up, and you're not young anymore. You would have had to sell eventually." I listened to him explain my life to me. I let him do it. "There's going to be a settlement offer," he continued. "Vanessa's working with the attorneys on it. It's fair, Dad. It'll set you up for the rest of your life. A decent property, somewhere smaller, some investment income. Colton," I said, "you could actually rest, You could actually—" "Colton." He stopped. "I just wanted to hear your voice," I said. Silence again. Longer this time. "What does that mean?" "It means I haven't talked to you in a while," I said. "I miss my son. Whatever else is happening, that part is just true." I paused. "How are you? How is Vanessa?" The silence that followed was the sound of a man trying to figure out what I was doing. He couldn't, which was exactly where I needed him. "We're fine," he said slowly. "We're good. The project is on track." "Good," I said. "I'm glad to hear it." I said goodbye and I hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a while after that. The house was very quiet. Outside, through the window, the sky over the mountains was going dark in layers. That specific blue-purple sequence that you only get at altitude that I had watched from this window for 40 years. I picked up my pen, opened the yellow legal pad I'd been using to map out what I knew, and I wrote down the date and the time and a single note to myself. "He's not worried. Keep it that way." That's it. The following month was the hardest of my life in a way that is difficult to explain because the difficulty was quiet. It was the difficulty of keeping your composure when everything in you wants to move, wants to act, wants to stand up and declare what you know. Carol kept telling me to be patient. Roy kept the ranch operation running in a strange, liminal state. The hands technically employed by a property they didn't believe belonged to Vantage Pacific, all of us existing in this suspended reality where everything looked normal from the outside and nothing was normal at all. Vantage Pacific had sent a property manager out once to introduce himself and walk the fence lines with a clipboard. Roy had been courteous. He'd also, without being asked, made sure to document every single thing that was said and done during that visit, including the property manager's observation that the operation seems well maintained, a comment that would later matter in ways the man couldn't have anticipated. Meanwhile, I was building something. With Marguerite's help, I had traced the financial irregularities back to their source, a series of accounts connected to a holding company Colton had incorporated 5 years earlier under a name that meant nothing to me at the time, Mesa Crest Ventures, LLC. Mesa Crest had received payments, moved money, and served as the financial skeleton for the entire scheme. When Carol's forensic accounting specialist examined the Mesa Crest records alongside the ranch's financial records, the picture that emerged was clear enough to make the specialist go quiet for a long moment, before saying, in a measured professional voice, that what she was looking at constituted evidence of systematic fraud over a period of years. I also reached out carefully to 2 people I had written off as lost causes. The first was a former county commissioner named Art Bevins, who I'd known for 30 years and who had retired 2 years ago under circumstances that had made him quietly furious at several of the same real estate development interests now connected to Vantage Pacific. Art was not a man you went to for legal advice. He was a man who knew where things were buried, who knew which officials had taken which favors, and who had very little left to lose. He agreed to meet me for lunch at a diner in Millhaven, a town 30 miles from the ranch, and when I laid out what I had, he looked at it for a long time and then said, "You know what the funny thing is? Vantage Pacific's managing partner has been having conversations with 2 county planning officials about expedited approval for the development permits, conversations that nobody put in writing." "Funny," I said. "Hilarious," Art said. He closed the folder I'd given him. "What do you need?" The second person was a woman named Diane Kessler, who was an investigative reporter for a regional business journal called the Mountain States Economic Review. I had never spoken to Diane Kessler before in my life, but Carol had, and she trusted her, and after a 2-hour meeting in Carol's office in Denver, Diane had a recording of our conversation and a copy of the key documents in the case held under a strict embargo agreement. She would not publish anything until I told her she could. She was very calm about all of it. "This is the kind of story," she said, "that waits for the right moment." She paused. "What's the right moment going to be?" I told her I'd know it when I saw it. I drove back from Denver that evening through the mountains, the highway empty, the dark hills on either side, and I thought about patience, about what it costs and what it buys, about Ruth telling me once, early in our marriage when I was young and hot-tempered and wanted everything resolved right now, that the best moves were the ones that looked like no move at all until it was too late to counter them. She was right about most things, Ruth. She was right about that. The notification I had been waiting for came in the second week of November. Vantage Pacific Holdings and Mesa Crest Ventures, working in concert with what was now clearly Colton and Vanessa's operation, had announced a grand opening event for what they were calling the Clearwater Summit Development, a gala. Investors, local officials, bankers, press, the formal unveiling of Vanessa's vision for the property, to be held in mid-January at the site itself, a large event tent erected near the location of the main barn. On my land, in the barn I had built. I read the announcement twice, then I set it down on the kitchen table in that house that no longer legally belonged to me, and I felt something settle inside me. Not calm exactly, but something like the moment before a storm, when the air gets very still and you can tell, without any ambiguity, what is coming. I picked up my phone and sent Carol a message with just 3 words. "It's time. Move." Then I looked out through the window at the mountains and the sky over the land my father had given me and his father had given him, and I let myself for just a moment remember every morning I had stood in this kitchen and watched the sun come up over that ridge line. Then I got to work. The message I sent Carol that November night was 3 words, but what it set in motion was anything but simple. Over the following weeks, I learned something about revenge that nobody tells you. It's not hot. Real, effective, meaningful payback is cold. It runs on patience and precision, not fury. Fury gets you arrested or dismissed or laughed out of court. Precision gets you your land back. Carol called me the morning after I sent her message, early enough that the sun hadn't fully cleared the eastern ridge yet. I was already up. I'd barely slept. "Before we move," she said without preamble, "I need to ask you something, and I need the honest answer." "Ask," I said. "Is there anything in your history with this property? Any agreement, any document, any conversation you had with Colton that he could argue constituted permission? Even informal permission? Because their attorneys are going to look for anything that muddies the water, and I'd rather know now than be surprised later." I thought about it. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, running back through every interaction I'd had with Colton over the years, in which business had come up, every time I'd said something casual that could be pulled out of context and made to sound like something it wasn't. "There was a conversation about 5 years ago," I said. "He brought up the idea of restructuring ownership. Putting the ranch into a family LLC, he said, for tax purposes. I told him I'd think about it. Did you sign anything?" "No, I told him I'd think about it, and I never thought about it again. He didn't push it at the time." "Okay," I heard her writing. "That's manageable. That's actually useful. It shows he proposed a legitimate path, and you didn't take it, and then he went around you. That supports our narrative." She paused. "What about Roy? His crew? Would any of them have documented the normal operational chain of command? Anything that shows you were clearly the functioning owner and decision-maker right up to the moment of the transfer?" "Roy kept logs," I said. "He's been keeping daily operational logs for 19 years because I asked him to when we had an insurance dispute back in 2006. Every work order, every decision, every instruction I gave dated and signed." Carol was quiet for a moment. "Gideon, those logs may be the single most important thing we have." She wasn't wrong. Roy brought the logs to my temporary rental, a small house I'd taken outside of Millhaven, the closest I could get to the ranch without technically trespassing, in 3 large cardboard boxes, loading them into my living room with the careful reverence of someone delivering something irreplaceable, which is exactly what they were. 19 years of handwritten daily records, Roy's blocky, careful print documenting every decision made on that property, every instruction received, every visitor, every incident. The transfer had happened in August. Roy's logs showed me directing operations through the first week of September, 3 weeks after the fraudulent transfer had allegedly made the property no longer mine. "This right here," Marguerite said, sitting on my floor surrounded by open binders, tapping one page with her finger. "September 3rd. You gave Roy instruction to delay the north pasture seeding because the soil temperature was wrong. That's you. That's your decision. That's you acting as the owner of property that Colton had supposedly already sold." "He couldn't tell Roy," I said. "He knew Roy wouldn't go along with it, so he let the operation run on its own momentum and hoped nobody would notice the timing." "He underestimated Roy," Marguerite said. "He underestimated everyone who actually worked that land," I said. December arrived cold and early that year, snow coming down from the passes before Thanksgiving had even cleared. I was living out of boxes in the Millhaven rental, driving past the entrance to my own property on mornings when the weight of everything made me need to see it, just see it, from the road, the way the fence line ran and the mountains sat behind it. I never turned in. I didn't trust myself to stay calm if I did. Colton and Vanessa were in Telluride. I knew this because Art Bevins, who had become something like an intelligence source at this point, had contacts in that area who kept casual track of things. They were living well. A ski house in the mountains, dinners at expensive restaurants, the kind of life that photographs beautifully if you don't look too hard at what paid for it. What I didn't know, what I would learn later from Diane Kessler's reporting, was that behind the beautiful photographs, things were not entirely smooth. Vantage Pacific had committed to a construction timeline for the Clearwater Summit development that was aggressive, and the investors who had signed on were sophisticated enough to be asking regular questions about progress. Vanessa, as the public face of the project, was managing those relationships personally, and managing them required a particular kind of sustained performance. The performance of a woman in total control of a project built on a foundation she knew was compromised. That kind of performance is exhausting. It frays things. There was reportedly an argument in early December between Colton and Vanessa about the pace of the legal proceedings. She had apparently expected my challenge to resolve itself faster, had expected me to fold, or to accept a settlement, or simply to be less organized than I turned out to be. When Carol filed the initial fraud challenge in district court the week before Thanksgiving, Vanessa had been furious in a way that surprised even Colton. Not because she feared losing, she still didn't believe they would lose, but because the public filing created a record, a visible dispute, that made certain investors nervous. "Keep him quiet," she had apparently said. Those were the words that got back to me, secondhand, from a source I won't name because they trusted me with something they didn't have to share. Keep him quiet. As though I were a problem to be managed rather than a man whose life's work had been taken from him. I want to tell you what that phrase did to me when I heard it. I want to be honest about this rather than heroic. It made me angry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be angry since the beginning. Not the cold, functional anger I'd been running on, but something hotter and more personal. The idea that I was, in Vanessa's calculus, simply noise to be reduced. That 40 years of my life amounted to something that needed to be kept quiet. I sat with that anger for a long evening, and then I decided to let it clarify me rather than consume me, because that was the only thing that would actually help. The next morning, I called Art Bevins and said, "Tell me everything you know about Vantage Pacific's investor structure." Yang. What Art told me over the course of 2 phone calls and 1 long lunch at the same Millhaven diner took a while to fully absorb. Vantage Pacific Holdings had been assembled as a development vehicle specifically for the Clearwater Summit project. Its investor pool was relatively small, 7 principal investors, all of them high net worth individuals or family offices, most with other real estate holdings in the region. They had contributed capital in stages, tied to development milestones. The managing partner, a man named Theo Ralston, whom I'd never met but whose name appeared in documents I'd now read hundreds of times, had represented the land acquisition as clean and uncontested. He told them there were no encumbrances, Art said, pushing his coffee cup aside. No liens, no disputes, no complications with the title. He lied, I said. He either lied or Colton lied to him. Either way, the investors don't know there's a fraud case attached to their investment. He looked at me. They're going to find out eventually. Question is whether they find out from you directly before the gala or whether they find out from the courtroom later. I turned that over carefully. This was territory Carol and I had discussed. The question of when and how the investors became aware of the legal challenge. If they found out too late, after they'd made additional capital commitments, the losses would be larger and the legal complications messier. If they found out through proper legal channels, served with notice as interested parties in the proceeding, they would have time to protect themselves. And an investor who felt deceived by Theo Ralston and by Vantage Pacific was an investor whose interests were suddenly very aligned with mine. File the amended complaint, I told Carol that evening, the one that names Vantage Pacific as a party to the fraud, and make sure it's properly served. That triggers notice obligations, she said. Ralston will have to inform the investors. I know, I said. There was a pause. Gideon, once this goes to the investors, it gets harder to contain. Ralston is going to push back hard. Let him, I said. Hard pushback from a man who told investors their title was clean looks like exactly what it is. I want them to see who he is under pressure. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've thought about this more than I have." "I've had a lot of quiet evenings," I said. Hot. The amended complaint was filed the second week of December. The response from Ralston's attorneys came within 4 days, and it was aggressive in the way of people who are frightened and trying not to show it. Motion after motion, procedural challenges, a letter to Carol's firm that stopped just short of threatening sanctions. It was the legal equivalent of someone raising their voice, and raising your voice is something you do when you've lost the argument and you know it. What happened next? I did not plan directly, but I had known it was possible. One of the 7 Vantage Pacific investors, a woman named Patricia Holst, who ran a family office out of Santa Fe, had a business attorney who was more thorough than most. When Patricia received the legal notice naming Vantage Pacific as a defendant in a fraud proceeding, her attorney immediately requested the full title history on the property. What he found, or rather what he could not find, was any clear documentation that the title had been fully verified at the time of Colton's transfer to Vantage Pacific. The standard title insurance that should have been in place had a gap. The specific representations Ralston had made to Patricia about the clean transfer were not reflected in the underwriting record. Patricia Holst called Theo Ralston and asked him to explain this. I was not on that call. I have pieced together what happened from what came out later. What I know is that Ralston could not explain it satisfactorily, and that Patricia's next call was to her attorney, and her attorney's next call was to Carol Ashby. By the end of the 3rd week of December, one of Vantage Pacific's 7 investors had quietly made contact with my legal team, not to join the case, just to listen, to understand what we had. Colton called me that week. It was the first time he'd called since that strange conversation back in October, the one where I'd told him I just wanted to hear his voice and left him off balance without knowing why. This call was different. He was not rehearsed. "Dad," he said, and something in the single word already told me things had shifted. I think we should meet." "All right," I said, "not through the attorneys, just you and me, like normal people." I noticed the phrasing, like normal people, as though what he had done was simply a business decision that reasonable people could discuss over coffee and resolve, as though what sat between us was a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate theft. "Where?" I said. "There's a place in Glenwood, the diner on 5th, neutral ground." I agreed to meet him. Carol told me not to go. Roy told me not to go. Marguerite told me I was making a mistake. I heard all of them and I went anyway because I understood something they didn't. Colton asking for a meeting meant the confidence they'd built around this scheme was developing its first real cracks. And a man with cracks in his confidence is a man who will tell you things he shouldn't. He was already there when I walked in. I hadn't seen him in person since before any of this had happened, close to 5 months. He looked different in a way that was hard to name. Still well-dressed, still carrying himself with the posture of a man who was doing fine. But around his eyes, something had changed. A tightness. The specific kind of tired that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from maintaining a version of yourself that isn't entirely true. I sat down across from him. The waitress came and I ordered coffee. Colton already had a cup in front of him, mostly untouched. "Thanks for coming," he said. "You're my son," I said. "You asked to meet." Of course I came. Something passed across his face when I said that. He looked away. "I want you to understand something," he said. What happened, it wasn't meant to hurt you. The intention was never to leave you with nothing. The settlement offer is real. It's substantial." "Colton," I said, "the ranch was never going to Colton." My voice stayed flat and even, the way it does when I mean it most. "Stop explaining the decision to me. I understand the decision. Tell me something else." He stopped, looked at his coffee cup. "Vanessa," I said, "how long had the 2 of you been planning this before you did it?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "The specific plan, maybe 2 years, but the thinking about it," he stopped, rubbed the side of his face. "Longer." "How much longer?" "Dad, it doesn't—" "How much longer, Colton?" He met my eyes for the first time since I'd sat down. "Since before Mom died." The diner was not quiet. There were other people, conversations, the sound of the kitchen, but I experienced a particular quality of stillness in that moment. Ruth had been sick for 14 months before she passed, and while she was sick, while I was driving her to treatments and managing the ranch and trying to be present in 2 places at once, my son had been thinking about how to take what she and I had built together. I don't know what showed on my face. I tried to keep it still. I think I mostly managed. "I see," I said. I wasn't. He stopped. Tried again. Vanessa had the idea, the development concept. She'd been researching the land values for years, and Did you come here to tell me something, Colton? Or did you come here to explain Vanessa to me? He flinched. It was small. I don't think he knew he did it. I came here, he said slowly, because I think there might be a way to resolve this that doesn't destroy everyone. The investors are getting nervous. Ralston he's not good under pressure, and that worries me. And if this thing goes all the way to trial, the things that come out— What things? I asked. The financial records? The account structure? Some of the— He stopped himself, looked at me carefully. You've already found the Mesa Crest accounts. It was not a question. I've been running this ranch for 40 years, I said. I kept records of everything. He sat back. Something left his face. Not guilt. Guilt had never been the dominant emotion with Colton, but calculation. He had been trying to assess how much leverage he still had, and he had just learned the answer. If this goes to trial, he said, Vanessa's business is finished, everything she's built. Yes, I said. That's likely. And the investors in the development bomb will have been defrauded, I said, by you, by Vanessa, and by Theo Ralston, who told them the title was clean. He looked at the table. He was doing math in his head, the kind of math that has nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with consequences. Is there anything I can do? He said. Finally, quietly. I looked at my son across that diner table, this man I had held as a baby, taught to ride, worked beside for years, loved in the complicated and imperfect way that parents love children who turn out to be different from what you hoped. And I felt something that was not forgiveness and was not hatred. It was something colder and sadder than either one. It was the recognition of a stranger. Yes, I said. You can tell the truth when you're asked to. I left money on the table for my coffee, and I walked out. The month between that December meeting and the January gala was the longest of the entire ordeal. Not because nothing was happening. Things were happening constantly, the legal machinery grinding forward, Carol filing motions, the forensic accountants finalizing their report, Diane Kessler quietly making calls and building what she'd told me was going to be a comprehensive piece when the time is right. But because I had to hold all of that still while Colton and Vanessa and Vantage Pacific continued building toward the grand opening as though nothing was wrong, as though the ground weren't moving under them. They sent out formal invitations to the Clearwater Summit grand opening event in early January. A glossy printed card, I saw a copy through Art's contacts, with an embossed letterhead and a photograph of what the development would look like when complete. Elegant ranch-style homes arranged across rolling hills, a community center, riding trails, the whole dream of expensive Western living rendered in architects' renderings that bore a passing resemblance to land I had grazed cattle on for 4 decades. The event was scheduled for January 17th, a Saturday. A tent had been erected, catering arranged, a small string quartet for the cocktail hour because Vanessa believed that the presence of live music signaled seriousness to high-net-worth guests. Local officials had been invited. The county commissioner, a state representative, the mayor of the nearest incorporated town. Regional press would be there. Several of the Vantage Pacific investors were flying in, including Patricia Holst. When Art confirmed that Patricia would be attending, I sat very still for a moment, and then I called Diane Kessler. The gala is January 17th, I said. I know, she said. Will you be there? I've already requested press credentials, she said. Vantage Pacific's PR firm approved them yesterday. They think I'm doing a regional development success story. A pause. I do my best work when people underestimate me. I've noticed, I said. There was one more person I needed to talk to before the 17th. Someone I had been avoiding, not out of cowardice, but out of a need to be fully ready before I had the conversation. Because some conversations, once started, change the shape of everything that follows. I drove to the ranch on a gray January morning, not down the main drive, but along the back county road that runs parallel to the eastern property line, a route I knew because I had driven it 10,000 times, and because the fence along that edge was something I had built myself, post by post, over 3 summers in the late 1980s. I pulled over where a gap in the scrub oak gave a long sight line across the pasture toward the main buildings. The event tent had been erected near the barn, white, large, professionally done. It looked like something that had been dropped onto my land from another world. Roy's truck was parked near the equipment shed. I could see him moving between the buildings, doing what he always did, checking, maintaining, keeping things running through sheer force of routine and loyalty. 19 years of it. I thought about the logs in those 3 cardboard boxes in my living room and felt something I couldn't entirely name. I didn't call him. I just sat there for a while, looking at the land, and let myself feel the full weight of what I was about to do. Because bringing it all down at that gala, exposing the fraud in that specific, public, irreversible way, meant that a lot of things would shatter at once. Not just Vanessa's development, not just Colton's reputation, but the version of my relationship with my son that had survived, however distorted, however painful, up to that moment. After January 17th, there would be no version left to misread. I needed to be sure I could live with that. I sat with it until I was. Then I drove back to Millhaven, called Carol, and told her we were ready to proceed exactly as planned. She asked me if I was okay. "No," I said, "but I'm clear." "That's enough," she said. "That's all you need to be." I went inside and ate dinner alone in the small rental kitchen and did not let myself think about Ruth or the house or Calliope grazing in the pasture or any of the 1,000 things that made the land what it was to me. I ate and I washed the dish and I went to sleep. 6 days until the 17th. The morning of January 17th, I woke at 4:30 without an alarm. Old habit. The ranch had trained me to it over decades. That particular pre-dawn awareness, the body knowing before the mind does that the day requires something. I lay in the dark of the Millhaven rental for a few minutes and listened to the silence and thought about Ruth. Not in a grief-soaked way, just she was there, in my mind, the way she often was at important moments. The way a person stays present in you long after they're gone, not as a ghost, but as a kind of internal compass. I thought about what she would have said if I'd called her the night before and described what I was about to do. She would have been quiet for a long moment. That was Ruth's way when she was thinking seriously about something. And then she would have said, "Gideon, make sure you're doing this for the right reason. Not just to win, for the right reason." I'd asked myself that question every day for 3 months. The answer was always the same. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even really about the land, though the land was everything. It was about the principle that a person does not simply get to take what someone else built. That there are consequences to treating another human being, your own father, as an obstacle to be routed around. That dignity, once demanded, must be defended. I got up and made coffee and reviewed the plan one final time, though I had reviewed it so many times by then that it existed in my mind as a complete structure, every piece in its place. Carol would be arriving at the event with her associate, a young attorney named Marcus Webb, who I'd met twice and found methodical and calm in a way I appreciated. They would carry documentation. Not everything. Not the forensic accounting report, not the full evidentiary record, but enough. A targeted surgical package of materials prepared specifically for this moment and this audience. Investors, officials, press, people who needed to understand what they were standing in the middle of. Diane Kessler would already be there, credentialed as press, moving through the room before we arrived. She was not going to publish anything that evening. The story was embargoed until the legal proceedings allowed it. But her presence served another function. People who are aware they're being observed by a journalist behave differently. They get careful. Careful people make fewer moves they can't take back. Art Bevins was not going to be at the event. Art was the kind of person whose presence at a gathering like that would signal something to people who knew him. Instead, he was available by phone, and he had made 2 calls in the preceding week, both to county planning officials who had attended the event, both carrying the same quiet message. You might want to know what's going to happen at that gala before you decide how visible you want to be there. Whether those officials had adjusted their plans accordingly, I didn't know. I hadn't tried to control that. I just made sure the information was available. Roy was the piece that had required the most careful handling. He was not going to attend either. I had asked him not to, for a reason I'd explained to him plainly. I needed him on the property when everything started moving, not at a party. He was the one person who could speak to the operational reality of the ranch, who had actually worked it, managed it, documented it, and I needed him available, reachable, and ready to provide testimony if the legal proceedings escalated quickly after the event. He'd agreed, but not without pushing back first. "You've been alone through most of this," he said. We were standing in the parking lot of a gas station outside Mill Haven because that was where we met when I needed to talk to him away from the rental, away from any location that felt connected to anything. I'd feel better being there. "I know," I said, "in case something goes sideways." "If something goes sideways," I said, "the most useful person to have is you on the ranch, not in a tent with investors." He looked at me for a long moment in the way of a man deciding whether to keep arguing. "You know what I remember about the day your wife passed?" he said. Not what I expected. "Roy, you went out that same afternoon and fixed the section of fence along the creek that had been leaning for 2 weeks. I watched you do it. You didn't say anything to anybody, you just went out and fixed it." He was quiet for a moment. "I figured that was just who you were. You fix what you can fix." I didn't trust my voice for a second. "Yeah," I said. "Something like that." "Fix this one, Gideon." He got back in his truck. "I'll be at the property." Yes. I arrived at the entrance to what had been my land at 5 minutes to 7 in the evening. The event was well underway. It had started at 6. And through the bare winter trees I could see the white tent lit from inside, warm yellow light against the January dark. Cars filled the temporary lot that Vantage Pacific had graded at the edge of the north pasture. A parking attendant in a dark vest waved people in. Music carried, faint and slightly absurd in the cold air. I sat in the car for 2 minutes, not hesitating. Just arriving, the way you have to sometimes arrive at a moment before you can walk into it. My phone buzzed. "Carol, we're inside at the east side of the tent near the presentation stage. When you're ready." I got out of the car. The night was clear and brutally cold, the temperature having dropped through the afternoon into the low teens. My breath fogged immediately. I walked across the frozen ground. My ground, under my boots, even if no document in the county recorder's office currently agreed. And I moved toward the tent entrance. No one stopped me. I hadn't been named on any exclusion list because Colton and Vanessa hadn't imagined I would show up. That was the thing about people who believe they've already won. They stop watching the exits. The tent was large and well appointed. Vanessa had taste, I'll give her that. Round tables with white linens, low centerpieces, a long bar running along the west side, a presentation stage at the north end where the architectural renderings of Clearwater Summit were displayed on illuminated panels. There had to be 80 or 90 people, local officials in their best clothes, looking slightly uncomfortable. Investors in the understated expensive way of people with real money, regional press near the back, including Diane Kessler, who I clocked immediately without looking directly at her. And near the stage, a cluster of people that included Theo Ralston, silver-haired, tanned, the kind of physical confidence that comes with having moved through the world without ever being truly held accountable for anything. And beside him, Vanessa. She was dressed beautifully. She looked like exactly what she wanted to look like, a successful woman in total command of her moment. She was talking to a couple I didn't recognize, investors from the way she was holding herself, and her hands were moving in that animated, assured way she had when she was performing for an audience. Colton was to her left. He saw me before she did. I watched it happen in real time, the moment my son registered my presence in that room. The color didn't leave his face so much as something else left it. Some assumption he'd been carrying. His eyes found mine across 60 feet of warm tent air and the expensive chatter of people who didn't yet know what was about to happen, and I held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then I looked away and moved toward where Carol and Marcus Webb were standing near the east wall. "He's seen you," Carol said quietly as I reached her. "Yes." "Vanessa?" "Not yet." I glanced toward the stage. "Give it 2 minutes." Carol handed me a drink, water, not wine, and positioned herself so that the documents she carried were accessible but not obvious. Marcus was already in conversation with a man nearby whom he'd apparently established a connection with before I arrived. Smooth, professional, completely natural looking. I'd underestimated Marcus. The program was set to begin at 7:15. It was currently 7:03. Vanessa would speak first, then Ralston, then a brief address from the county commissioner. After that, a toast and the formal unveiling of the scale model of the development. It was never going to get that far. At 7:08, Colton reached Vanessa. I saw him put his hand on her arm, lean close, speak into her ear. She stiffened. Not visibly to the room. She was too controlled for that. But I was watching specifically, and I saw it. The slight arrest of motion, the recalibration. She said something back to him without changing her expression, and then she looked across the room and found me. Our eyes met. I raised my glass toward her slightly. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement. I'm here. I've been here longer than you know. Something moved across her face that I suspect she'd never shown publicly before. Raw calculation stripped of its pleasant surface coating, running fast. She said 2 more words to Colton, touched his arm once, and then turned back to her investors with a smile that was technically perfect. Colton moved toward me. I let him come. Dad. He was keeping his voice low, his posture casual, aware that people around us couldn't know there was anything wrong. What are you doing here? I was invited, I said. You were not invited. No, I agreed. But Diane Kessler was. I didn't look at Diane when I said it. Neither did he immediately. Then he couldn't help himself, and he found her across the room, and I watched him register what that meant. And Patricia Holst is here. I let that one land. His jaw tightened. And your father, it turns out, isn't quite as finished as you thought. This isn't the place, he said. You chose the place, I said. You put a tent on my land and invited 80 people and called it a grand opening. I'm just attending. Dad, something in his voice changed. The performance cracked just slightly at the edge, enough to let something real through. Not remorse. I wasn't sure Colton did remorse in the traditional sense, but something closer to fear. If you do whatever you're planning to do in this room tonight, it's going to be ugly. For everyone, you know that. Yes, I said. It doesn't have to be this way. If you just... Colton. I looked at my son directly. You planned this for years. You executed it while your mother was dying. You forged my name and sold my home, and when it was done, you went to a ski house in Telluride and had dinner in expensive restaurants. I paused. What way did you think it was going to be? He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected him to. Step back, I said, not unkindly. Let it happen. You made your choices. This is where they go. He stood there for another moment, and I saw him see that it was over. Not just the evening, but the version of events he'd been managing. He turned and walked back toward Vanessa, and whatever he told her next made that perfect smile drop for just a fraction of a second before she caught it. At 7:14, 1 minute before the program was set to begin, Carol approached Patricia Holst. I did not hear that conversation. I watched it. Patricia was a compact woman in her early 60s with close-cut gray hair and the specific stillness of someone who has spent a career making large financial decisions. She listened to Carol for about 90 seconds. She looked at 2 pages of what Carol showed her. Then she looked up across the room toward Theo Ralston, and the expression on her face shifted in a way that told me everything I needed to know about what she understood. She turned and said something to the man standing with her, her own attorney, as I later learned, who had accompanied her to the event. He took the pages from her, read them, and was already reaching for his phone. Ralston was moving toward the stage when his own phone buzzed. He looked at it, frowned, and stepped back from the stage. He looked toward his own assistant, a young man who was always nearby, and said something. The young man moved quickly toward the back of the tent. The program was supposed to start at 7:15. At 7:15, nothing happened. The string quartet, reading the room with the particular sensitivity of professional musicians who have played many events, let the current piece extend slightly rather than stopping. The room continued its conversation, glasses in hand, unaware that the timeline had just broken. At 7:19, Carol approached the event coordinator, a nervous young woman with a headset and a clipboard, and handed her a legal document. I couldn't hear what Carol said. I could see the coordinator read the document, look up, look at Carol, look at the document again. At 7:22, Theo Ralston found me. He was the kind of man who was impressive when he was in control of a room and considerably less impressive when he wasn't. He came across the tent toward me with the momentum of someone who has decided that direct confrontation is still a viable option, which told me he hadn't yet read everything Carol had delivered. "Mr. Mercer," he said, not quietly enough. Several people nearby heard him and looked.
"I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is a private event and you—" "The document your coordinator just received," I said, "is a notice from the district court that the property on which you're currently standing is subject to a fraud proceeding that challenges the foundational transfer in your title chain. The court has issued an interim order preventing any further development commitments on this property pending resolution." I paused. "You may want to call your attorneys." He stared at me. "That's not—" "Your investors are already reading it," I said. He looked across the room. Patricia Holst was now in quiet but clearly intense conversation with two other people I recognized from the investor list, a man named Gerald Cho from Portland, and a woman whose name I didn't know, but whose body language as she read the pages Carol's team had distributed was not the body language of someone planning to continue with the evening's program. Ralston pulled out his phone and called someone. His voice dropped, and he turned away from me, but I could see his posture changing, that slow collapse of the spine that happens when you're hearing something on the phone that confirms what you'd hoped wasn't true. The string quartet finally stopped playing. In the absence of the music, the room reconfigured itself. Conversations shifted. People moved toward clusters. The atmosphere changed in that specific, unignorable way of a gathering that has lost its center of gravity. Vanessa moved toward the stage. I think she had decided that the only move left was to take control of the room herself, to step up, address whatever was happening, and try to perform her way through it. She had done it before in other situations, probably. Used her considerable composure to hold a room together through something that should have broken it. She got to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, Ms. Mercer Hartley." Carol's voice was not loud, but it carried with the clarity of someone who has spent 20 years in courtrooms. She was standing in the center of the tent, and the people around her had created a small natural space, sensing something official in her posture. "Before you proceed, I'd ask that you and the other principals make yourself available to speak with the investigators from the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit, who have been notified of this proceeding and have requested voluntary statements this evening." The room went very still. "Investigators," Vanessa said. Her voice stayed even. It cost her something I could see, but it stayed even. "They're waiting outside the tent," Carol said. "This is voluntary at this stage, but given the document filed today and the evidence accompanying it, I would strongly recommend against continuing the program or making any additional representations to the investors present." Someone near the back of the tent, I didn't see who, said, loudly enough to be heard, "What kind of fraud?" Carol looked at that person with the calm of a woman who had prepared for exactly this question. "The transfer of the property that forms the basis of this development was executed using a forged signature. The transferor, the original owner, never consented to the sale. The title chain for this entire project is compromised." The room reacted the way rooms do when they collectively understand that the thing they've gathered to celebrate is not what they were told it was. Not with shouting or visible panic. These were not that kind of people. But with that particular charged silence and the rapid quiet movement of people toward each other, toward phones, toward exits. Gerald Cho was on his phone within 30 seconds. Two other investors moved together in a way that made it clear they were comparing information. The county commissioner, who had been standing near the stage preparing to give remarks, now stood with his own aide in intense whispered conversation, both of them angled away from the cameras. Ralston was gone. I didn't see him leave, but he was no longer in the tent. Vanessa was still at the microphone. She had not moved. Her face had done something I had never seen it do in the years I had known her. It had become very still in a way that was not composure. It was the stillness of a woman standing in the wreckage of something she had spent years building and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that it cannot be salvaged by anything she says next. Colton was standing near the east wall. He was looking at the floor. I walked to the center of the tent.
Not to the microphone. I didn't need the microphone. I just needed to be visible in that specific room on what had been, and would be again, my land. I am not a dramatic man by nature. I don't make speeches. I've spent most of my life believing that what you do matters more than what you say about what you do. But there was something I needed these people to understand, not for my satisfaction, but because truth, when it has been buried, deserves to be spoken aloud. "My name is Gideon Mercer," I said, in a voice that carried without effort across the now quiet tent. "This is my family's land. My father ranched it. I built the barn that's 30 yards from where you're standing. My wife is buried in a grove on the eastern edge of this property." I looked around the room, not at Vanessa, not at Colton, but at the investors, the officials, the press, the people who deserved to know what they had been drawn into. The transfer that made this project possible was built on a forged document. You didn't know that. I'm telling you now, in front of witnesses and press and the documentation that proves it, so that every decision you make from this point forward is an informed one. Silence. "That's all I have to say," I said. I walked toward the tent entrance. The people near the door moved aside. I don't know what my face looked like as I walked through. I know the cold hit me when I stepped outside. Clean, hard, honest cold, and I stood in it for a moment and looked up at the sky. January stars, hard and bright over the mountains, the kind of sky my father used to say put everything in proportion. My phone buzzed, a text from Diane Kessler. "That was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever watched. Are you okay?" I stood there in the cold and I thought about that question. Then I typed back, "Ask me in about 6 months." I walked back to my car and sat in it and did not move for a long time. Inside the tent, through the canvas, I could hear the sound of the evening continuing to come apart. Not chaotically, but with that particular bureaucratic grinding that happens when money and law and consequence all arrive in the same room at once. Phones ringing, voices carrying the specific clipped urgency of people in damage control. The string quartet had packed up. The bar had stopped serving. Carol found me at the car about 40 minutes later. She was moving quickly, and there was something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not quite excitement, but something adjacent to it. The look of a lawyer who has spent a career building cases and knows when one has just cracked open the way they need it to. "Patricia Holst has requested a full accounting of all funds committed by her family office to this project," she said. "And she's named Ralston's firm in a separate complaint. Gerald Cho is talking to his own attorneys, and..." She paused, and I could tell she was deciding how to say the next thing. "Colton is still inside. He's been speaking with the district attorney's investigator for the past 20 minutes. I looked out the windshield at the dark. "Is he in custody?" "No, it's voluntary at this point. But his attorney arrived 8 minutes ago, which suggests someone made a very fast phone call." She put her hand briefly on the top of my car window, the closest thing to a gesture of comfort I'd seen from her in 3 months of working together. "Gideon, the foundation is cracked. Everything they built on top of it is going to come down." "I know," I said. "How are you?" I thought about Roy standing in that parking lot telling me to fix this one. I thought about the logs in the cardboard boxes. I thought about Marguerite on the floor of my rental house surrounded by binders, looking up with that expression of anger I'd never seen on her face before. I thought about the phone calls and the patience and the long cold months of holding still when everything in me wanted to move. "I'm tired," I said. It was the most honest answer I had. She nodded like she understood. "Go get some rest. I'll call you in the morning." She walked back toward the tent. I watched her go, this woman who had taken my case when it looked unwinnable, who had never once suggested I step back or accept less than what was right. I started the car. Driving back through the dark toward Mill Haven, past the fence lines I'd built, and the gates I'd welded, and the turnoffs I knew by feel rather than by sight, I kept both hands on the wheel and drove at an even speed and let the night go by. At one point, a cluster of deer moved across the road ahead of me, and I slowed and waited for them to clear, and for a moment their eyes caught my headlights before they disappeared into the brush. My land, my deer, my road. Not yet, on paper. But the paper was changing. The rental house was cold and quiet when I got back. I turned up the heat and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the overhead light, just the small lamp in the corner, and I let myself sit in the silence without trying to fill it. My phone buzzed one more time before I went to bed. A number I recognized but hadn't expected tonight. Frank Delgado. The man who had told me to take the settlement and start fresh somewhere. The man who had stopped returning calls when the fight looked hopeless. I stared at the name on the screen for a long moment. Then I set the phone face down on the table and went to bed. Some things I had learned over the course of this particular season of my life could wait until I was ready for them, and I had gotten very good lately at deciding what I was ready for and what I wasn't. The morning would come, the proceedings would continue, the ground, once cracked, would keep giving way. I had done what I came to do. The call I had been waiting for came on a Tuesday morning in late March, 10 weeks after the gala. Carol's voice was different. Not the measured, strategic voice she used during working calls, the one that gave nothing away until she was ready to give it. This was something looser, something that had released a tension she'd been holding for a long time. "The district court has ruled," she said. "The transfer is void. The sale to Vantage Pacific is void. The title reverts to you, Gideon. Full ownership, restored as of the original transfer date." I was standing in the kitchen of the Millhaven rental. I had a cup of coffee in my hand. I set it down on the counter very carefully, the way I'd set down that first cup on the porch the morning Dale Pruitt came to see me. And I stood there with my hand still on it and did not say anything for a moment. "Gideon?" "I'm here," I said. The forged signature determination was unambiguous once the forensic analysis was submitted. The handwriting expert's testimony combined with Roy's operational logs and the Mesa Crest financial records, there was no version of events that held up under that weight. Colton's attorneys tried 3 separate motions to suppress portions of the evidence and failed on all 3. She paused. "The judgment also opens the door to the civil fraud claims, against Colton, against Mesa Crest as an entity, and against Theo Ralston personally for misrepresenting the title to investors." "And Vantage Pacific?" "Dissolved, effectively. Ralston filed for voluntary dissolution 2 weeks ago. The investor recovery litigation is separate and ongoing. Patricia Holst's attorneys have been thorough. Colton is named in that as well." She paused again. "There's going to be criminal referral consideration. The DA's office hasn't committed yet, but the Economic Crimes Unit has been in contact with our office twice in the past month. Given the forged notarization and the documented financial irregularities going back 8 years, I think it's likely." I absorbed that. Criminal referral. My son's name and the words criminal referral occupying the same sentence. I had known this was a possible outcome. I had understood it intellectually for months. But understanding something intellectually and standing in a cold rental kitchen, hearing it spoken plainly, are 2 very different experiences. "How long before I can physically return to the property?" I asked. "I'm filing the certified judgment with the county recorder this afternoon. Technically, you can return tomorrow. I'd recommend we go together with documentation and make the return formal, just to create a clear record for any subsequent proceedings." "Tomorrow morning," I said. "I'll be there at 9. I hung up and stood at the kitchen counter for a long time. The coffee went cold again. I didn't drink it. I want to be honest about what I felt that morning, because I think people expect a certain kind of response to news like that, and the truth is messier. I had fought for this outcome for 5 months. I had planned and sacrificed and held myself together through things that should have broken me. And when it finally came, what I felt was not triumph. It was not even simple relief. It was grief. Not for the land. The land was coming back. It was grief for the version of my son I had continued to half believe in, even during the worst of it. The Colton who had spent 3 weekends rebuilding Walt Garner's barn at 12 years old. The Colton who had cried at his mother's funeral with his whole body, ugly and unself-conscious in a way that had seemed, at the time, like proof of something real underneath. I had carried that Colton with me through all of it, the way you carry an image of someone you loved before they became the person who hurt you. That day, standing in that kitchen with the court's ruling sitting in my phone, I let that version go. Not in anger, not with any dramatic internal declaration, just let it go, the way you release a breath you've been holding so long you've stopped noticing it. Then I called Roy. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "It's done," I said. The sound he made was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when something he has held up by sheer will for a long time is finally allowed to come down. "Tomorrow morning," I said. 9 o'clock. I'm coming home. The night before I returned to the ranch, I did something I hadn't let myself do since October. I went through the box of photographs I had brought with me to the rental, a shoebox that Ruth had organized years ago, labeled in her handwriting on a piece of masking tape. Ranch. U.S. The Good Years. I sat on the floor of the Millhaven rental with the box open between my knees, and I went through every photograph. Ruth standing in front of the house the summer we finished framing it, squinting into the sun, one hand raised to shade her eyes. Both of us at the fence line the year we added the east pasture, looking tired and satisfied in the specific way of people who have just completed something hard. Colton, at maybe 7 years old, sitting on the back of Calliope's predecessor, a gray quarter horse named Tucker, with the expression of a boy who believes the world is going to keep giving him things. Roy, younger than I could easily reconcile with the man I knew now, standing in the original barn doorway, with his arms folded and an expression of concentrated purpose that hadn't changed in 19 years. I stayed with those photographs for a long time. Then I put them back in the box and set it by the door so I would remember to bring it when I left in the morning. You don't recover from a betrayal like this by pretending it didn't shape you. You carry it, and you decide what to do with the weight. Carol arrived at the property entrance at 9:03 the next morning. I was already there, parked on the county road, watching the frost on the fence posts catch the early light. She pulled up alongside me and we drove in together, her car first, mine behind, down the gravel drive I had driven 10,000 times. The event tent was gone. Vantage Pacific had removed it in the weeks following the gala, retreating quickly once the legal situation became clear. The lot they'd graded for parking was still raw and ugly, the frozen ground churned and bare in a way that would need reseeding come spring. The main barn stood as it always had. The house stood as it always had. From a distance, you might not have known anything had happened here. Roy was waiting at the barn. Marguerite was with him, which I hadn't expected. She had driven out from Buckhorn without telling me, which was exactly the kind of thing Marguerite did. She hugged me once, firmly, said nothing, and stepped back. Roy shook my hand and held it for a moment longer than usual. "Anything damaged?" I asked him. "Some equipment was moved around when the Vantage Pacific property manager came through," he said. "Nothing broken. I made sure of that." He said it in a way that let me know he had been intentional about it, that the 19 years of care he'd brought to this land had not paused for a single day regardless of whose name was on the title. "The horses?" I said. "Calliope's fine. She's been grouchy, which means she missed you." I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. We walked the property that morning, Carol, Roy, Marguerite, and me, doing the formal return walkthrough that Carol needed for the record. She took photographs and made notes and asked procedural questions in her methodical way while Roy answered, and I mostly just walked and looked and let myself be back in a place I had never entirely left in my mind. At the east end of the property, near the oak grove, I stopped. The others walked ahead without me, understanding without being told that I needed a minute. I stood at the low iron fence that bordered the small cemetery plot and looked at Ruth Stone and said nothing out loud. I just stood there, in the cold morning light, on the land she had helped me build and had asked me to tend. Tend what you're given. I would. The weeks that followed the court ruling were not quiet weeks. People who had been absent during the fight had a way of reappearing afterward, and dealing with them required a particular kind of patience that I found harder to manufacture than the patience I'd needed during the legal battle itself. At least during the fight, I had known who was with me and who wasn't. Now the lines blurred in ways I found irritating. Frank Delgado called 3 more times before I picked up. When I finally answered, he was effusive in the way of a man trying to compress a lot of apology into a short call. He told me he should have stood by me. He told me he hadn't understood the full picture. He told me he hoped I didn't think badly of him. I told him I didn't think badly of him. That was true, as far as it went. I didn't think badly of Frank Delgado. I just thought differently about him than I had before. There's a distinction there that matters. Thinking badly of someone takes energy.
What I had for Frank was something quieter, the calm, clear-eyed recognition of exactly what kind of friend he was, which was the kind who showed up when the showing up was easy. Tom and Linda Haverhill left a message. I didn't return it for 2 weeks, and when I did, the conversation was brief and civil, and we both knew, without saying it, that something had changed permanently. They had made a choice. I had noticed. We could still be polite to each other, but the intimacy of those Christmas dinners was not coming back, and pretending otherwise would have insulted both of us. The person who surprised me was Art Bevins. Art didn't call after the ruling. He didn't send a message or stop by or make any acknowledgement of what we'd done together. About 3 weeks after I returned to the ranch, I happened to see him at the feed and hardware store in Mill Haven, loading bags of mineral supplement into the back of his truck. He saw me, nodded once, and kept loading. I walked over and helped him with the last 2 bags without being asked. We stood there in the parking lot for a moment. "You good?" he said. "Getting there," I said. He nodded again, got in his truck, and drove away. That was it. That was the whole conversation, and somehow it was the most satisfying exchange I had in the entire period following the ruling, because Art Bevins was a man who did what he did because he believed it was right, and then moved on without requiring anything in return. I understood that kind of person. I wanted to be more like it. Colton's situation deteriorated through the spring in ways I mostly learned about through Carol rather than directly. The civil fraud judgment against him and Mesa Crest was significant. The forensic accountant's final report had documented just over $74,000 in irregularities from the ranch accounts over 8 years, and the damages calculation in the civil proceeding added penalties and interest that brought the total exposure well into 6 figures. His personal assets, which had been substantially tied up in the development venture and in properties he and Vanessa held jointly, were largely frozen pending the investor recovery litigation. The criminal referral came through in April. I learned about it from Carol in a 15-minute phone call that she delivered in the same measured, professional voice she used for everything, and when she was done, I thanked her and hung up and went outside and walked to the barn and stood there for a while doing nothing in particular. I want to be clear about something. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard about the criminal referral. I know that's not the expected response. People who had followed the story, and by that point, Diane Kessler's piece had been published in the Mountain States Economic Review and had been picked up by several larger outlets, so more people knew about it than I was entirely comfortable with, seemed to expect that each new development in Colton's legal troubles should register as victory, as justice delivered. What I felt was closer to a dull, persistent ache, the kind that's not sharp enough to demand attention but never quite goes away. My son, the stranger who wore my son's face, was facing criminal charges for what he had done to me. And the correct, true, appropriate response to that, the response that I had set in motion and had understood from the beginning, was where this was likely to go, still felt like something I had to process, rather than something I could simply accept as finished. This is the part of these stories that people don't tell you. Winning is not the same as healing. Getting back what was taken is not the same as never having had it taken. You go on, and the going on is real, and it matters, but it's not seamless. There are mornings when you wake up, and the first thought in your head before you're fully conscious is something from the worst of it. The conversation with Dale Pruitt, the word trespassing, that October morning when the sky was gold and everything was ordinary right until it wasn't. You can't just turn those mornings off. You learn to get up anyway. Vanessa was a separate chapter, and a complicated one. Her situation legally was distinct from Colton's in ways that Carol explained carefully and that I will try to summarize accurately. She had not signed the forged documents herself. Her role, legally speaking, was as a beneficiary and co-architect of the scheme rather than its direct executor, a distinction that mattered enormously in criminal terms, though less so in the civil proceedings. The investor litigation named her, and the damages there would be significant. But the criminal exposure fell primarily on Colton and on the notary whose license had already been revoked. What happened to their marriage during this period I learned about mostly through secondhand sources and occasional glimpses rather than directly. I don't take satisfaction in reporting any of it, but honesty requires me to say that by late spring, Vanessa had retained her own separate legal counsel,
distinct from the attorneys she and Colton had shared, and that the Telluride property had been listed for sale. Whether she was protecting herself legally or whether the marriage itself was fracturing under the weight of consequence, or both, I couldn't say with certainty. What I knew was that the woman who had sat at my kitchen table with that bright professional smile, asking about acreage and mineral rights and appraisals, was no longer living the life she had engineered all of this to obtain. The development was dead. The investor money was in litigation. The reputation she'd built in regional real estate circles had been dismantled by Diane Kessler's article in a way that reputation, once dismantled in print, struggles to recover from. I thought about that sometimes, in the unguarded moments. Not with pleasure, with something more like a tired, complex acknowledgement that choices have trajectories, and some trajectories are very long, and the people at the start of them can rarely see the end from where they're standing. She had looked at my land and seen money. She had never once seen what it actually was. Bus. The hardest thing that happened in this period was not legal. It was a letter. Colton wrote to me, handwritten, which surprised me. 4 pages in his careful, blocky print. His handwriting had always been neater than you'd expect from him, something he'd gotten from Ruth. It arrived at the ranch in early May, addressed to me with no return address, though the postmark told me roughly where he was. I sat with that letter unopened on the kitchen table for 2 days. When I finally read it, I did it once, straight through, without stopping. He did not ask for forgiveness. I'll say that plainly because it matters. He did not try to minimize what he had done or explain it in a way that reframed his culpability. What he wrote was, in its way, the most honest communication I had ever received from my adult son, which was its own particular form of painful. The recognition that it had taken the complete destruction of everything he'd tried to build before he could write something real. He wrote about the LLC conversation 5 years ago, the one I'd told Carol about, where he'd suggested restructuring ownership and I hadn't taken it further. He wrote that he'd been angry about that, angrier than he'd let on, because he'd seen it as me refusing to trust him with any real partnership in the operation. He wrote that the anger had become something else over time, something he'd let Vanessa's planning give shape and direction to, and that by the time he understood how far it had gone, the momentum of it had carried him to a place where stopping felt more impossible than continuing. He wrote, and this is the part I've thought about most, that he knew while he was doing it that it was wrong, and he did it anyway. And there is no version of that he could explain to me or to himself. He did not ask to come back. He did not ask for a relationship. He asked, in the second-to-last paragraph, whether I was well, whether the ranch was okay, whether Calliope was still giving everyone trouble. And in the last paragraph he wrote, "I'm sorry, Dad. I know that's not enough. I know there may not be anything that's enough. But I wanted you to have it in my own handwriting so you'd know I meant it." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the drawer of the desk in the front room. The same desk where Ruth used to do the household books on Sunday evenings. I did not respond immediately. I sat with what the letter made me feel, and I gave myself permission to not know, yet, what I was going to do with it. Forgiveness is not a door you can force open from the outside. Either the mechanism works or it doesn't, and you can't always tell which it is until you've had time to sit with a thing long enough to see it clearly. What I knew that day, reading that letter in the kitchen of the house I had built on the land I had taken back, was this. The man who had written it was not entirely the stranger I had called him in that Glenwood diner. But he was not entirely my son either. He was something in between, someone who had done an irreparable thing and was learning to live with that, the same way I was learning to live with it from the other side. I left the drawer closed and went out to do the afternoon check on the cattle. 3 people came to the ranch uninvited in the weeks following the ruling, and each of them required a different response. The first was a reporter from a Denver television station who had picked up Diane Kessler's story and wanted to do a segment. I told him, through Roy who met him at the gate, that I appreciated the interest and that I had nothing further to add to what was already in the public record. Roy conveyed this in the direct way Roy conveyed everything. The reporter left. The second was Dale Pruitt. He came on a weekday afternoon and I saw his truck coming down the drive from the front window, and I went out to meet him before he knocked. He looked older than he had the day he'd brought me that manila envelope. He'd lost weight or sleep or something. I should have told you more that morning, he said. He was standing on the gravel, holding his hat in his hands. What I knew about the process, about what might be possible to challenge, I gave you less than I should have. You told me my options, I said. I told you half of them. He looked at the house. I knew Colton. I didn't want to believe what the document suggested, so I packaged it up as cleaner than it was. I looked at him for a moment. Are you here to apologize or to confess? He almost smiled. Probably both. All right, I said. I hear you on both. We stood there a moment. He put his hat back on. The ranch looks good, he said. It always looked good, I said. That part was never in question. He nodded, got in his truck, and drove out. That was enough. The third uninvited visitor was one I hadn't anticipated at all. It was a woman I didn't recognize. Late 40s, dark hair, dressed practically, driving a truck that had seen serious use. She knocked on the door on a Saturday morning, and when I opened it, she said, Mr. Mercer, my name is Sandra Ogle. My family had a small property adjacent to yours, about 40 acres on the south boundary. We sold it 8 years ago when my father got sick. She paused. I read the article about what your son did and how you fought it. I've been thinking about something connected to our property line, and I wanted to talk to you about it, if you have time. I stood at the door and looked at her, and she looked at me, and there was something in her face that was not pity. I had developed a sensitivity to pity by that point, but something closer to recognition, the look of one person who has navigated loss toward another. I have time, I said. Come in. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where so much of the story had played out, where I had pored over binders and talked to Carol on the phone and eaten alone in the dark months of the rental. And she explained that her family's former property, now owned by a small timber company, shared a water easement with my land that had never been formally recorded but had been honored by both families for 30 years. The timber company, emboldened perhaps by the period of confusion over my ownership, had moved to block the easement access. It was a problem, a real one. But it was a manageable problem, the kind that has a legal pathway and requires documentation and patience, rather than the kind that requires you to rebuild your understanding of everyone you trusted. I told her I would have Carol look into it. She thanked me, and we sat there for another few minutes talking about the land, about the families who had worked it, about what it means to be connected to a piece of ground through time. She told me her father had once told her that the land remembered the people who took care of it. I told her my wife would have liked that idea. She smiled in the way of someone who understood without needing more explanation. When she left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched her truck go down the drive, and I thought about how strange it was that in the aftermath of a theft and a legal war and a family dissolution, the thing that felt most like the beginning of something was a practical conversation at a kitchen table with a stranger who turned out to be a neighbor. Life does not resolve like a story. It keeps moving, right through the moments that feel like endings, dragging you along with it. The question is not whether you have to keep going. The question is what you're building as you go. I had some ideas about that. But the building itself, that was still ahead, and it required the kind of patient attention that I had spent 5 months learning I was capable of, in conditions far harder than what was coming now. I turned away from the window and went to find Roy, because there was work to do. And the work, as always, was where I actually lived. The gravel on the main drive needed resurfacing. That was the first practical thing I noticed when I returned. Not the mountains, not the sky, not the particular quality of light that I had missed for 5 months in that Mill Haven rental. Just the gravel, rutted from the heavy vehicles Vantage Pacific's contractors had run over it during the period they'd believed it was theirs to use. Small damage in the context of everything that had happened. But the kind of small damage that tells you exactly how deeply someone else's indifference has run, right down to the surface you walk on every day. I had the drive resurfaced in the second week after my return. Roy oversaw it. I watched from the porch with coffee in my hand and felt something settle that I couldn't have named precisely. Not satisfaction exactly, but something like the physical sensation of a house being re-leveled after a foundation shift. The correction of something that had been wrong. That was the shape of the first months back. Correction after correction. Not dramatic ones. Just the steady, methodical work of reclaiming not just the land itself, but the rhythms of it, the daily routines, the seasonal decisions, the 10,000 small acts of attention that constitute the actual life of a working ranch. Reseeding the lot. Vantage Pacific had graded, repairing the section of north fence that had been neglected during the period of legal limbo. Getting the equipment back into the configuration I'd maintained for years, undoing the reorganization the Vantage Pacific property manager had imposed during his brief tenure with his clipboard, and his assumption that he understood a place he'd spent 3 hours in. Roy worked alongside me through all of it without needing direction. 19 years of shared understanding of how a piece of ground is supposed to function. That doesn't go away because someone puts a different name on a deed for a few months. We worked, and we didn't talk much more than we ever had, which was exactly right. There were harder things running underneath the practical work, though, things that required a different kind of attention. But the civil judgment against Colton and Mesa Crest was finalized in late June. The number was substantial, larger than I had fully anticipated, even having seen the forensic accountant's projections. Between the documented financial irregularities from the ranch accounts and the damages calculation tied to the fraudulent transfer itself, the judgment came to just over $480,000. Carol explained the collection process to me in her precise way, noting that Colton's available assets had been significantly diminished by the investor litigation and by the costs of his own legal defense, and that collecting the full judgment would take time and was not guaranteed. I told her I understood. What I didn't tell her, but what I had been sitting with privately for several weeks by then, was that I had already made a decision about the judgment that I hadn't fully articulated to anyone yet. Not even to Roy. Not even to Marguerite. I had decided I would not pursue the collection aggressively. I want to explain that clearly because I know how it sounds, and I know there are people who will hear it as weakness or as the kind of misplaced sentimentality that lets people who do wrong things escape their consequences. That is not what it was. The ranch was back. The title was clear. The fraud was documented in the public record and would follow Colton and Vantage Pacific through every future professional and financial interaction they had for the rest of their lives. The criminal proceeding, which moved slowly as criminal proceedings do, was in the hands of the district attorney and would run its course regardless of what I did with the civil judgment. I had gotten what mattered, and spending the next several years in active collection litigation, tracking assets, filing motions, managing the ongoing legal costs, would mean keeping myself tethered to this wound rather than letting it scar over and allowing the scar to become just another part of me. Ruth would have understood that. I believe that without needing to be certain of it. I instructed Carol to file a satisfaction of judgment for a negotiated partial settlement, an amount that covered my legal costs and acknowledged the financial damage without requiring me to financially destroy a man who was already destroyed in every way that mattered. Carol was quiet when I told her. "That's your decision to make," she said finally. "I know it is," I said. "You're sure?" "I've thought about it for 2 months," I said. "I'm sure." Another pause. "Gideon, most people in your position would want every dollar." "I know," I said. "I'm not most people in my position. I'm just me." She filed the paperwork, and I put that chapter in the drawer alongside Colton's letter, and I closed it and went back to the work of living. Summer came to the valley the way it always did, sudden and generous, the hills going green almost overnight after the late snowmelt, the cattle moving up to the higher pasture, the days stretching long and warm in the way that makes you understand every single year why people have fought and sacrificed and held on to land in this part of the world for generations. There's something about a mountain summer that makes the winter that preceded it feel like a necessary cost rather than a punishment. You endure the cold because it produces this. You hold on because holding on makes the arriving worth something. I had made changes. Some of them had been forming in my mind during the long months of the fight, in the spaces between legal strategy and documentation and careful patience. Some of them had crystallized in the conversation with Sandra Ogle at my kitchen table, in the recognition that the land and the community around it were connected in ways I had perhaps not been tending as carefully as I'd tended the fence lines and the water rights. The first change was hiring. I brought on 3 new ranch hands that spring, all of them from the Harlan County area, all of them people who had been struggling to find stable work after a timber operation to the north had scaled back. Roy vetted them, which was the only vetting that mattered. 2 of them had children. One of them, a man named Luis Reyes, who was 26 and had grown up on a small family operation that hadn't survived the last decade's market pressures, had a quality of attention to the land that I recognized from a long way off. The way he walked a fence line, the way he read the cattle. Some people are built for this kind of work and some people are not, and Luis Reyes was built for it the way I had been. I told him that directly, one afternoon when we were checking the east boundary together. He looked at me like he wasn't sure whether to believe it. "I mean it," I said. "You have the instinct. That's not something you can teach." He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather had a ranch," he said. "About 200 acres in the valley south of here. He lost it when I was 12. Bank foreclosure." He looked out at the pasture. "I grew up thinking maybe that kind of life just wasn't available to people like us anymore." I thought about what to say to that. I thought about my father, who had worked this ground with tools that would look primitive now, in conditions that would look impossible. I thought about the 3 generations of hands and decisions and endurance that had produced the land I was standing on. "It's available to people who stay at it," I said. "That's the only qualification that's ever actually mattered." He nodded, not as if I'd resolved something for him, but as if I'd given him something to think about. That was enough. The second change was the community work program, though I didn't call it that because the name made it sound like something official and bureaucratic, which was the opposite of what I intended. What it was, practically, was this. I opened the ranch's equipment and facilities to 3 neighboring small operations on a cost-sharing basis, allowing them to use machinery they couldn't individually afford to own in exchange for labor during our high-demand periods. It was the way ranching had worked in this valley for most of its history, before the industry consolidated and everyone started treating self-sufficiency as a virtue instead of an isolation. It was the way my father's generation had operated as a matter of plain necessity. Sandra Ogle's family easement situation got resolved through Carol. The timber company had no defensible position once the 30-year history of the easement was documented, and they backed off with minimal formal proceedings. Sandra stopped by the ranch twice that summer, once to thank me, and once, a few weeks later, with no stated reason. She just came by, had coffee on the porch, talked about the land and the season, and a dozen things that had nothing to do with legal disputes. She was becoming a neighbor in the actual sense of the word, the valley kind of neighbor, where proximity and shared conditions build something over time that doesn't require formal establishment. I had missed that. I hadn't realized how much I'd let it atrophy in recent years, wrapping myself in the self-contained operation of the ranch, and forgetting that a piece of ground doesn't exist in isolation from the community it sits inside. The question of Colton's letter sat in that drawer through the summer. I returned to it occasionally, took it out, held the envelope, put it back. The decision of what to do with it was not urgent in any practical sense. He was not asking for anything. He was not awaiting a response in a way that had a deadline. He had sent it, and it was now in my possession, and what I did with that was entirely mine to determine. In August, 7 months after the gala, almost a full year after Dale Pruitt had knocked on my door with that manila envelope, I wrote back. It took me 4 drafts. The first was too cold. The second was too explanatory, full of the kind of language that sounds like processing rather than communicating. The third was too short, barely 5 sentences, and felt like I was giving him less than the moment required. The fourth was 2 pages, and it said what I actually meant. I told him I had read his letter several times. I told him I believed he meant it. I told him that believing he meant it did not change what had happened and did not restore what had been damaged between us, but that it mattered to me anyway. That it mattered in a way I couldn't fully explain, that he had written something true. I told him that I was not ready to talk to him in person, that I didn't know if that would ever be fully comfortable in the way it once had been, because some things that break don't go back to the exact original shape, and I had stopped believing that pretending otherwise was a form of love. It was a form of denial, and we had both had enough of that. I told him that the land was good, that Calliope was still giving everyone trouble, that Roy was still there, still running the morning checks with the same concentrated purpose he'd had for 19 years. And at the end I wrote, "You asked if I'm well. I am. more than I expected to be. I hope you're finding your way towards something honest. That's the only direction worth going. I didn't sign it. Love, Dad. I signed it Gideon, because that was what was true right then, and I had committed, somewhere in the long months of the fight, to only saying true things. I mailed it on a Thursday. Then I went back to the work. But I want to tell you something about what I learned, not what I won, the land, the judgment, the legal vindication. Those things mattered, and I am not going to pretend otherwise because dignity requires honesty, and the honest truth is that getting the ranch back was everything. But winning and learning are different things, and what I learned is what I carry forward. I learned that the people who stay when staying is costly are the only people whose presence you can trust. Roy, Marguerite, Carol Ashby, who took a case that looked unwinnable because she believed in it. Art Bevins, who helped because it was right and never once asked for acknowledgement. Sandra Ogle, who became a neighbor because she showed up. These are not numerous people, they are not the crowd, but they are the ones who matter, and I had confused the crowd for the community for too long. I learned that patience is not passive. Every person who told me to let it go, to accept the settlement, to start fresh somewhere smaller, they were confusing patience with surrender. True patience is not the absence of action. It is the discipline of choosing the right moment for the right action and holding still until that moment comes, regardless of how long the holding cost you. I had never understood that as clearly as I understand it now. I learned that loyalty to an idea of someone, the Colton who spent 3 weekends rebuilding Walt Garner's barn, the boy who cried at his mother's funeral with his whole body, can blind you to who that person is becoming right in front of your eyes. I am not entirely sure what the lesson is there. Not to love people less, certainly, but perhaps to watch them more honestly. To let your love for someone include the clear-eyed recognition of what they are actually doing, not just what you hope they are. And I learned, this is the one that surprised me most, that the land does remember, not in any mystical sense, in the practical, physical, observable sense that Sandra Ogle's father had meant when he said it. The land remembers who tended it. The pasture that Roy had kept seeded through the entire period of legal limbo came back green and even in the spring because the attention had not stopped. The water rights I had documented and defended over decades held their ground in court because the documentation existed. The relationships I had built with this valley, with the soil and the seasons and the way the water table moved and the way the light hit the eastern ridge in October, those relationships had not been transferred away on a forged piece of paper. They had stayed with me. They had made me useful in a way that money couldn't manufacture and theft couldn't erase. You cannot steal what someone actually knows. You can take the title. You cannot take 40 years of understanding what the ground needs and when it needs it, and how to read the signs that something is wrong before it becomes unfixable. That knowledge was mine. It has always been mine. It will still be mine on the last day I am able to walk this land. The first frost of that second autumn came earlier than usual, rolling in from the northwest on a clear September night and silvering everything by morning. I was up before it had fully lifted, standing on the porch with coffee, always the porch. That is the one routine that has outlasted everything. Watching the frost melt back as the sun came over the ridgeline in the incremental way it does at altitude, one layer of cold yielding at a time. Roy came around the side of the barn and stopped when he saw me and raised his own cup in my direction. I raised mine back. That was the whole exchange. It was sufficient. Luis Reyes was already in the east pasture with the morning check, moving along the fence line with that attentive, unhurried walk I had recognized from the first week. The cattle were moving in their familiar morning pattern. Calliope was in the paddock being predictably difficult about her feed, and the mountains behind everything were doing what mountains in this valley do in September, standing enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to human drama in a way that is actually very comforting when you've had a year of human drama. I thought about my father. I thought about his father, whose name I carry in the middle of mine, who had broken this ground before it was anything and built it into something with tools and patience and a belief that what you put into land comes back to you over time if you put in enough and wait long enough. I thought about Ruth, who had stood on this same porch in every season for 31 years and understood without needing to explain it that this place was worth whatever it cost. I thought about all of that, and then I finished my coffee and went inside and put the cup in the sink and went out to start the day, because that is what you do. That is, in the end, the entire answer. You go out and you start the day, and you bring to it everything you know, and you tend what you're given, and you do not let anyone, not a son, not a scheme, not a forged signature, not 5 months of legal war, take from you the understanding of who you are and what you were built to do. The ranch is mine. It has always been mine in the ways that matter most. The paper just finally caught up. And now, I want to speak directly to you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. Maybe you're sitting somewhere tonight carrying something heavy, a betrayal you didn't see coming, a loss that came from the direction you least expected it, from family, from someone you built a life alongside, from someone whose name you trusted with everything you had. Maybe someone looked at what you spent your life building and decided it was theirs to take. Maybe people told you to let it go, to accept less, to start over smaller somewhere, to stop fighting because the fight looked hopeless from the outside. I want you to hear this clearly. You have the right to stand on what you built. You have the right to demand that the truth be told, even when telling it is costly, even when the room is full of people who don't want to hear it, even when the person who wronged you is someone you once loved without reservation. Your dignity is not contingent on anyone else's approval of your decision to defend it. Your life's work is not negotiable simply because someone with enough nerve decided to negotiate it without your consent. But I also want you to hear the harder thing, the thing that took me longer to learn. Winning is not the destination. It is a waypoint. What you do after you win, who you become in the aftermath, what you build from the wreckage, how you hold the people who stayed, and how you reckon with the people who didn't, that is the actual story of your life. The fight is the dramatic part. The living is the important part. Don't let bitterness become your permanent address. I have seen what that costs. Not in my own life, but in the lives of people who won their fights and then never left the battlefield, who kept fighting ghosts because they didn't know how to lay down the weapon. Bitterness is just grief that forgot how to move forward. And grief, real grief, is supposed to move. It's supposed to bring you somewhere. Tend what you're given, protect what you built, stand firm on your own ground. And then, when it's time, when the fight is done, turn back toward the living and walk into it without looking over your shoulder every other step. That is the whole lesson. Everything else is detail. The frost is gone now, melted into the grass, and the September sun is doing what it always does over these mountains. The day is asking for what days always ask for. I'm going to go give it.